Okay, well, my name's Steve Weissman. I'm a lecturer at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California at Berkeley. And before that, I directed the energy program at the law school at UC Berkeley. So most of the work I do relates to energy and climate in one way or another. So I'm not sure where you want me to go with that, but there's. Well, an organization like the Local Government Commission can serve the needs of various kinds of local governments, but it probably is most valuable to the smaller cities and counties that don't have enough population or enough money to justify having their own policy department. So I think that probably the most useful thing that one can do to help local governments is to identify specific problem areas where there's a need. Maybe there's an objective to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or reduce energy costs or improve transit times. And then the question is, what are the barriers that get in the way of accomplishing that, and how do you most effectively clear those barriers out of the way? And so I think especially for the smaller governments that can't do this on their own, if you can have some form of analysis that looks at the general objectives and the barriers, etc., and lays that all out, and then offers some steps that the local governments can take to try to address these issues, then I think that's really most helpful and most effective. And so that's what we did at the Local Government Commission. We created what we refer to as guidebooks on various topics, and land use planning, solid waste management, recycling, handling toxics, energy efficiency, things like that, and then would provide recommendations about things that could be done. And then we'd hold workshops and conferences to allow people from various local governments to hear about that and ask questions. Well, let's first talk about what the objectives were of the Iwani principles. We actually pulled together some of the most innovative architects and land use planners and said, okay, you're all interested in reducing reliance on private vehicles for transportation, etc. What are the concepts that you have in common? What are the things that ought to apply to any new development? And then we listed out, there's a give and take process, and we created a list of principles. And so what's the objective of doing that? Well, let's say you've got a decision-making body, a local government, city council, board of supervisors, maybe state legislature or regulatory agency, that probably the first step you want to go through is to get that organization's agreement to general concepts. And then after you've gotten that, then you come back and say, remember how you said you agreed that we should have a connecting path for walkability from one end to a complex to the other? Remember when you said that? Well, okay, now here's what we need to do to accomplish that. And so here's the plan we would like to develop in order to improve walkability. And so then the decision makers are going to have to reflect, well, we did agree that we wanted to reach these objectives, and so this looks like a good way to get there. And then you come back a third time and say, well, remember when you said we should pursue this plan? Well, now we've developed a budget. This is how much money we need to get the job done, and will you approve this budget? And so then if you kind of walk through things incrementally like that, then you've got an opportunity to potentially get the decision-making body to move more quickly and more effectively in a particular area. So that concept, I think, still applies very well. You could take the Iwani principles themselves and apply them to a new proposed housing development or planned community, and they'd still be very relevant. You don't have to rewrite them to make them work. But it's not the specific words of that set of principles that's so important. What's important is having a set of principles and then trying to implement them. So for instance, you could take something that was drafted in 1991, like the Iwani principles, and you could have a public conversation in a particular community. These were the principles that seemed to make sense. Do we still agree with all of these things? Would we like to change out some things for other things? Would we like to just scrap this and start from scratch? Do we agree that it makes sense to have some set of principles? So it's a conversation starter. But if you look at the principles, there's nothing dated about them. There's nothing that says, based on today's technology or based on today's rules or budgets. It's all very general, I think generally applicable concepts. So there's no particular reason you have to throw them out and start over. Well, it's kind of a self-answering question, isn't it? I mean, there's, if Korea doesn't have jurisdiction over the pollutants coming from China, then it can't do anything directly to reduce that source of air pollution. So what are you left with? You're left with the efforts to have treaties and agreements between the two countries that would help to reduce pollution. Maybe there's some trade-offs that can be made. Maybe Korea could agree to take on certain industries in exchange for China doing something. I don't know exactly how that would work, but it would have to be some form of international agreement. Another way to try to get there would be to work through the United Nations. Have principles adopted through the United Nations to recognize the rights of every country downwind countries to have clean air. In the United States, we faced a somewhat similar situation when a lot of utilities toward the middle of the country were building large coal-fired power plants, and they'd have put big, tall smokestacks on them to make sure that the pollution would move away from the local area, and the wind would carry it to the east, and it was depositing particulates, but also was acidifying streams and soil, because the acid rain particulates would come out of the pollution, and then it'd settle on the ground. And when it would rain, the rain would dissolve everything and would get into the soil and get into the water tables, and so that was a big problem. And so there was a set of rules created requiring people who are upwind to have better controls on their power plants. Now that's all within one country. So even though you had different states and you had different objectives in the different states, you at least had the federal government that could overlay all of that and establish common rules for everybody. And you don't have the advantage of that between China and Korea. So I think you've identified a very, very difficult problem to solve. Well, I think the worst conflicts are going to be, as the climate changes, there's going to be resource shortages in various places. You're not going to have clean water everywhere. You're going to have very bad air quality. Crops aren't going to be able to grow in some places because it's become too hot or too cold, or there's too much drought, or whatever the circumstances are. And I think there are likely to be conflicts over access to resources. That's, I think, going to be the biggest problem. Not so much conflicts about whether such and such country should stop polluting. It's going to be more about how do we take the limited resources of the planet and use them. And if you want to have a good parallel to that currently, just look at what the impact has been from people's desire to have access to oil and the conflicts the wars that have occurred in the Middle East and the the strained relationships between Russia and some of the Eastern European countries that rely on Russia's natural gas, etc. So, I mean, we already see wars and starting and international relationships being altered because of an interest in getting access to resources. Well, what's going to happen when China no longer can get as much water as it needs from the Himalayas? Will they be trying to take over Central Europe in order to get access to their water resources, or the United States, or how else it's going to play out? I think those are going to be the big problems, and the only answer I think people have been able to come up with so far has been to at least try to put a stop to how far climate change is going to go through international agreements such as the Paris Accords. And so the problem, of course, is Paris Accords were too weak in a couple of ways. The goals that were established were not strong enough in virtually any nation, but also they were basically voluntary targets for each nation, and so I think it was a movement in the right direction, but we have to get much more serious about this. And the fact that we haven't moved effectively over the last 50 years means we have to be moving extremely aggressively in the next 10 or 15 years. And so I think that there's I don't know if there's any substitute for trying to get broader international agreements. And I think to get there, I think the United States is in the way. I think the United States created most of the climate problem, is not taking responsibility for the problems that it's created. And then we've got this disgraceful attitude now that, well, we're going to pretend there's no such thing as climate change, and we're going to back out of Paris Accord. We'll be the only country in the world to do that, and this is just disgraceful. But I mean, hopefully we get somebody, and a lot of people running for president next time are running on climate change as a major issue for them. If somebody can get elected that way and then show strong leadership, I think that can make a difference, a big difference across the world. And so, there's just no substitute for strong international leadership in this area, and for stronger international agreements.